In the gray, wind-swept port of Calais, a royal messenger disembarked. He was not there to deliver a treaty or a declaration of war. He was on a far more delicate and far more sinister errand. He was there to procure a specialist, an artist. He was there to hire the finest executioner in all of Europe, not a common headsman with a clumsy, brutal axe, but an expert swordsman, a man renowned for his speed, his precision, and the clean, silent whisper of his blade. The cost was £23, a substantial sum worthy of a royal commission. This order, this grim transaction, was made on the authority of King Henry VIII of England. But here is the detail that transforms this from a simple preparation for an execution into the first act of a meticulously staged murder. This order was given on May 15, 1536. The trial of Queen Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom this sword was intended, had not yet concluded. The verdict was still 2 days away. The end of Anne Boleyn's story was written before the final chapter even began. Her guilt was irrelevant. Her fate had already been sealed, paid for, and was now sailing across the English Channel. This is not a story of why a king falls out of love with a queen. That is a simple human tale of passion, pride, and politics. This is the story of how. This is a blueprint for the political and psychological demolition of a human being. We will not be exploring the 7 years of courtship or the 1,000 days of her reign. We will be living inside the final 17. Our story is a countdown, a clock that starts ticking on the 1st of May, 1536, and stops with the final beat of a queen's heart at 8 o'clock in the morning on May 19th. We will witness the terrifying efficiency of the state machine, operated by the master engineer of ruin, Thomas Cromwell, as it isolates, frames, and crushes not just a queen, but a woman. We will chart the stages of her destruction, from the first whisper of suspicion to the shock of accusation, the agony of betrayal, the terror of isolation, and finally, the strange, calm acceptance of the inevitable. By the spring of 1536, Queen Anne Boleyn was the most powerful woman in England, but she was living in a gilded cage built on a brittle foundation. She had given the king a daughter, Elizabeth, but not the son and heir he desperately craved. Her sharp intelligence and fiery temper, which had once captivated Henry, now grated on him. And his eyes had wandered to a new, quieter, more placid woman, Jane Seymour. Anne was a tightrope walker who had run out of rope. She was surrounded by enemies at court, men who despised her for her Protestant faith and her ambition. She was protected only by the king's love, and that love had curdled into something cold and impatient. She knew she was in danger. What she could not possibly have known was the speed and the sheer methodical ruthlessness with which her world was about to be dismantled. On the morning of May 1st, the sun rose on Ashiu, Queen of England, preparing to watch the annual May Day joust. It was the last sunrise of her life that she would greet as a free woman. The machine was about to be switched on. She woke up a queen. She would go to bed a prisoner. The May Day joust of 1536 was a glittering spectacle, a pageant of chivalry and power. Queen Anne Boleyn presided from the royal box, the very picture of majesty. She was flanked by the king, her husband, Henry VIII. The sun glinted off the knight's armor, the crowd cheered, and for a few fleeting hours the illusion of a stable, powerful Tudor court was maintained. But it was only an illusion, a beautiful, fragile pane of glass about to be shattered. History has not recorded the exact moment, but at some point during the tournament, a note was passed to the king. The contents of that note have been lost to time, but its effect was immediate and catastrophic. Henry's face reportedly darkened. He rose abruptly, his retinue scrambling to follow. He left the joust without a word to his wife. His departure, a sudden public act of repudiation that sent a shockwave of whispers through the assembled nobility. Anne was left alone in the royal box, the guest of honor at a celebration that had just become her political funeral. This was not a spontaneous outburst of royal anger. It was a piece of meticulously crafted political theater, a public signal orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell. The Queen was no longer untouchable. The hunt had begun. The next morning, on May 2nd, while Anne was at breakfast in Greenwich Palace, a delegation of lords led by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, arrived. They were not there to pay their respects. They were there to arrest her. The charges were read out, each one a hammer blow of absurdity and malice, adultery, incest, and conspiracy to murder the king. The accounts from that moment paint a picture of a woman in utter shock. Anne, who had always been praised for her quick wit and sharp tongue, was momentarily stunned into disbelief, laughing at first, thinking it a grotesque joke. The laughter quickly turned to panicked denial. She had been Queen of England just yesterday. Now she was a traitor. As she was escorted from the palace, she surely understood the terrifying symbolism of her journey. She was to be taken by barge down the River Thames to the Tower of London, and she knew which entrance they would use. The tower had two main riverside gates. One was a formal entrance for royalty and honored guests. The other, set below the high water mark, was dark, foreboding, and slick with green algae. It was called Traitor's Gate. It was the gateway to interrogation, torture, and death, the point of no return for the greatest enemies of the state. As her barge approached, she saw it waiting for her. According to the chronicles, she fell to her knees at the tower steps, protesting her innocence to the uncaring stone. But the machine was indifferent to her pleas. The iron-jawed gate opened and then closed behind her, shutting out the sun and the world she had once ruled. She was now in the belly of the beast. The beast had a master. Thomas Cromwell, the son of a blacksmith, Cromwell was a man of supreme intelligence and terrifying efficiency. He was Henry's chief minister, the architect of the English Reformation. He was not a man driven by passion or personal hatred for Anne. He was driven by a cold, pragmatic loyalty to the king's will. Henry wanted Anne gone, not just divorced, which would be complicated and cast doubt on the legitimacy of his affair with Jane Seymour, but annihilated. He wanted her erased in a way that left no legal doubt, no possibility of a comeback, and no stain upon his own honor. It was Cromwell's job to provide the legal framework for this annihilation. His task was to build a case out of whispers, suspicions, and, if necessary, manufactured evidence. And he was very, very good at his job. The foundation of his case rested on turning Anne's own world against her. He needed confessions. He started with the weakest link. Mark Smeaton was a handsome, talented court musician of low birth. He was one of Anne's favorites, and his ambition may have made him careless. He was arrested and taken to Cromwell's house in Stepney for interrogation. While there is no official record of him being placed on the rack, it is almost certain that he was tortured, or at the very least, subjected to intense psychological pressure and the terrifying threat of it. The 16th century rack was a machine of excruciating pain, designed to dislocate every joint in the body. Under such a threat, a man would say anything. Smeaton broke. He confessed to having carnal knowledge of the Queen on 3 separate occasions. His confession was the key. It was almost certainly a lie, but it was a truth that Cromwell could now use as a legal battering ram. With Smeaton's testimony secured, the net widened. Sir Henry Norris was arrested next. This was a far greater shock. Norris was a high-ranking courtier, the groom of the stool, a position of intimate trust, and one of King Henry's oldest and closest friends. He fiercely maintained his innocence and Anne's. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Then came the most shocking arrest of all: George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Anne's own brother. The charge was incest. This was Cromwell's masterstroke of depravity. The accusation was designed not only to secure a conviction, but to utterly destroy Anne's reputation, to paint her as a debauched monster, a perversion of nature. The primary evidence against them was a sliver of overheard conversation, twisted into something sinister. George's wife, Jane Rochford, who reportedly despised Anne, provided a statement claiming that the Queen had told her Henry was impotent and had neither skill nor virility. This was twisted into evidence of a treasonous plot and an incestuous relationship. George, like Norris, denied everything, but it didn't matter. The machine was now fully operational. Cromwell had his victims and his confessions. He had successfully isolated the Queen from her friends and family, turning her inner circle into a circle of alleged co-conspirators. He had taken the flirtatious continental atmosphere of Anne's court, the poetry, the music, the witty banter, and reframed it as a hotbed of treason and sexual deviancy. Anne, now alone in her cold stone room in the Tower, could only wait and listen as the world she had built was systematically dismantled, and the men she had trusted were turned into weapons for her own destruction. The sounds she heard were not of a kingdom that loved her, but of the hammers of justice building her scaffold. Justice in Tudor England was not a blindfolded goddess holding a balanced scale. It was a sharp, heavy sword wielded by the king. The trials of Anne Boleyn and the men accused with her were never intended to be an impartial search for the truth. They were a piece of political theater, a carefully choreographed performance designed for a single purpose: to provide a veneer of legality for a series of state-sanctioned murders. The verdict had been decided before the first witness was called. The purpose of the trial was not to determine guilt, but to announce it to the world in the most damning way possible. The trials began on May 12, 1536. The lesser men, Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, and 2 other courtiers, were tried first. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. The only evidence of any substance was the confession extracted from Mark Smeaton under duress. The others maintained their innocence, with Norris, a man of considerable standing, eloquently defending himself and his queen. But their words were meaningless. When a man like Henry Norris, a lifelong friend of the king, could be condemned, it sent a terrifying message to everyone else. No one was safe. All were found guilty of high treason and sentenced to the most horrific punishment the law could devise: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was a sentence of calculated barbarity, a multi-stage execution designed to maximize public suffering and humiliation. 3 days later, on May 15th, it was Anne's turn. Her trial, along with her brother George's, was a grand public spectacle held in the King's Hall of the Tower of London. A special scaffold had been built, and over 2,000 spectators packed into the hall to witness the final act of this royal tragedy. The jury was not a panel of her peers. It was a carefully selected group of 26 lords, many of whom were her political enemies, men who stood to gain from her downfall. And presiding over this assembly, as Lord High Steward of England, was the man who perhaps despised her most: her own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. The entire event was a meticulously staged family betrayal, designed to add a final layer of humiliation to her destruction. The indictment read against her was a work of pure fiction, a document of such lurid and specific absurdity that it bordered on the surreal. The Crown accused her of committing adultery with the 5 men on specific dates and at specific locations, dates on which, it was later shown, she was not even in the same place as her alleged lovers. She was accused of plotting the king's death, of promising to marry one of her lovers after he was gone. And then came the most poisonous charge, that she had engaged in an incestuous relationship with her own brother, George. The indictment was not just a legal document, it was a character assassination, a pornographic fantasy designed to obliterate her name and justify her death. It painted her not as an unfaithful wife, but as a ravenous, unnatural witch who had bewitched the king and defiled the throne. But Anne Boleyn did not crumble. Unrepresented by counsel, as was standard for treason trials at the time, she stood alone and defended herself with the same intelligence, courage, and fire that had brought her to the throne. The accounts of those present, even those of her enemies, describe a woman who was calm, dignified, and utterly convincing. She listened patiently to the charges, and then, one by one, she dismantled them. With sharp logic and a clear, steady voice, she exposed the inconsistencies in the evidence, the impossibility of the timelines, and the sheer absurdity of the accusations. She did not plead or weep, she argued, she fought. For a few hours in that packed hall, it seemed as if the sheer force of her will might actually turn the tide. The spectators were reportedly swayed, with many convinced of her innocence. George Boleyn's defense was equally spirited. He was a renowned poet and intellectual, and he used his eloquence to ridicule the flimsy evidence against him. The primary proof of his incest was a note he had allegedly received from Anne, which he was not allowed to read aloud. In a brilliant act of defiance, he instead read it to the court, showing it to be nothing more than an innocent, teasing message. He then expertly refuted the testimony of his own wife, Jane Rochford, exposing the accusations as the product of spite and malice. For a moment, it seemed the Crown's case was falling apart under the weight of its own lies. But this was never a contest of evidence. It was a performance of power. The jury of lords, under the watchful eye of the king's ministers, conferred. Their deliberation was brief. They did not need to weigh the evidence. They only needed to deliver the verdict that the king demanded. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, stood to pronounce the sentence. As he spoke the word guilty, he reportedly broke down, the crocodile tears of a political survivor streaming down his face as he condemned his own niece. The sentence was read. Anne was to be burned alive or beheaded at the king's pleasure. Her brother George was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The king's mercy was swift. He commuted her sentence to beheading. It was presented as an act of compassion, a final kindness from a wronged husband. But even this was a calculated move. A burning at the stake was a messy, chaotic affair. A beheading was a clean, solemn, and final act of state power. And Henry had another refinement in mind. Anne, who had been a great admirer of French culture, would not be executed by the crude English axe, which often took multiple blows. She would be granted the dignity of a death by a single stroke of a French sword. The messenger, of course, was already on his way back from Calais. The stage was now fully set. The law had played its part. All that was left was for the final actor, the executioner, to make his entrance. The trial was over. The verdict was delivered, but the horror was just beginning. For Anne Boleyn, the 5 days between her sentencing on May 15th and her execution on May 19th were perhaps the cruelest part of her entire ordeal. The frantic energy of the trial, the fight for her life, was gone. It was replaced by a profound and terrifying stillness, a silence broken only by the tolling of the tower bells and the frantic thoughts inside her own mind. She was no longer a defendant. She was a condemned woman, living on borrowed time, her life now measured in hours. This was her final and most intimate torture, the agony of waiting for the end. Her jailer, the constable of the tower, Sir William Kingston, was a stern, unimaginative man, but his letters to Thomas Cromwell during these final days provide a haunting, almost minute-by-minute psychological portrait of a woman on the edge of eternity. He was her constant shadow, his primary duty to record every word she said, every mood swing, in the hope that she might finally confess or implicate others. These letters reveal a mind oscillating violently between terror, pious resignation, and moments of almost hysterical black humor. One moment, she would be weeping, lamenting her fate and the fate of her brother. The next, she would be laughing. On the morning after her sentence, she asked Kingston if she would be executed before noon. When he gave a non-committal answer, she reportedly burst into laughter, exclaiming, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." She then put her hands around her throat and laughed again. It was a shocking, almost unbearable display of gallows humor, the desperate laughter of a woman staring into the abyss, trying to reclaim some small measure of control over the grotesque theater of her own death. Kingston, a man not given to psychological analysis, was clearly bewildered by her behavior, writing to Cromwell that she was having great pangs. This waiting was a weapon in itself. The execution was initially scheduled for May 18th, but it was postponed at the last minute. No reason was given to Anne. Was it a clerical delay? Or was it, as she might have feared, a deliberate act of cruelty, a way for Henry to prolong her suffering? Every extra hour she was forced to live was another hour to contemplate the cold steel of the French sword that was now certainly waiting for her. She would ask Kingston if she would be put in a dungeon. He assured her she would remain in her royal quarters. She would ask about her father and mother, about the fate of her daughter, Elizabeth. The uncertainty was a form of torture all its own. And then, on May 17th, 2 days before her own death, she was forced to endure one last brutal spectacle. From the window of her lodgings, she would have heard the sounds of a crowd gathering on Tower Hill. It was the execution of the 5 men condemned with her, including her beloved brother, George. She was spared the sight, but she could not have been spared the sounds or the terrible knowledge of what was happening. Her brother, a man of wit and courage to the very end, gave a speech from the scaffold, skillfully denying his specific charges while admitting his general sinfulness. Then, the axe fell. 5 times. The men who had been the life and soul of her court were butchered, their deaths a bloody prelude to her own. On that same day, Cromwell delivered the final, most vicious blow. It was not enough for Anne to die a traitor. Her entire legacy had to be erased. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a man who had once been her family's chaplain and her greatest ally in the Reformation, arrived at the Tower. Under immense pressure, he sat with Anne, and in a secret ecclesiastical court, he interrogated her about her marriage to the king. The goal was to find a canonical impediment, a legal loophole to declare the marriage null and void from the very beginning. The likely pretext was Henry's previous affair with Anne's older sister, Mary Boleyn. Under church law, this created an affinity, a spiritual kinship that should have forbidden the marriage to Anne without a special papal dispensation. While Henry had secured one, it could now be argued that it was invalid. Anne, perhaps hoping to save her life at the last second, or perhaps simply exhausted and broken, agreed to the annulment. It was the ultimate humiliation. After everything she had fought for, after the years of courtship, after breaking England from the Catholic Church, after being crowned Queen of England, she was now being told that none of it had ever really happened. She had never been a queen. She had never been Henry's wife. She was just a royal mistress who had overstepped her bounds. And the most devastating consequence of this legal fiction was its effect on her daughter. With the marriage annulled, Princess Elizabeth was officially declared illegitimate, a bastard with no claim to the throne. This was Cromwell's checkmate. He had not only secured the Queen's death, but he had also cleared the path for Henry's new marriage to Jane Seymour and ensured that any future children they had would be the undisputed heirs. For Anne, it was a spiritual evisceration, a blow more cruel than any sword or axe. They had taken her crown, her friends, her brother, and now they had taken her daughter's birthright. There was nothing left to take. As the sun set on her final night on earth, a strange calm seems to have settled over her. The frantic mood swings, the hysterical laughter, the panicked questions, all of it fell away. She spent her last hours in prayer with her almoner, preparing her soul to meet its maker. She had been stripped of everything, but in doing so, her enemies had inadvertently given her one last powerful role to play. She would not die as a hysterical, disgraced adulteress. She would die as Anne Boleyn, the martyred queen. She meticulously planned her final performance, her speech from the scaffold, her final words to the world. The waiting was almost over. The swordsman from Calais had arrived. Dawn on May 19, 1536, broke cold and gray. The execution of a queen was not to be a public spectacle like that of the common men. It was a private, invitation-only affair, staged within the secure walls of the Tower of London on a lawn known today as Tower Green. A new, black-draped scaffold had been erected. This was not Tower Hill, the chaotic public stage of butchery. This was a place of solemn, state-sanctioned death. The audience was a carefully curated list of about 1,000 people, members of the King's Council, London dignitaries, the Duke of Suffolk, and the King's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. They were there not just as spectators, but as witnesses, their presence required to validate the finality of the act. Anne emerged from her quarters, dressed not in mourning black, but in a gown of dark gray or black damask, trimmed with ermine fur, the fur of royalty. It was a subtle but defiant statement. Over it, she wore crimson kirtle. Crimson was the color of Catholic martyrdom. Every detail of her appearance was a carefully chosen symbol. She was composed, dignified, her face pale but serene. She was not being dragged to her death. She was walking to her final terrible coronation. She ascended the scaffold, aided by her jailer, Sir William Kingston. There, waiting for her, was the swordsman from Calais, a figure cloaked in black, his face hidden, the instrument of his trade concealed in a bag at his feet. Anne looked out at the silent, watching crowd, and she began to speak. Her final speech is one of the most remarkable documents of the period. It was not a fiery declaration of innocence. It was not a bitter tirade against the king who had condemned her. To have done so would have been disastrous, a final act of treason that could have sealed her daughter Elizabeth's fate, marking her forever as the child of a traitor. Instead, her speech was a masterpiece of calculated submission and subtle defiance. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die," she began, her voice clear and steady. "And according to law, and by law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." This was for the lawyers and the king, a public acceptance of the legal verdict. She did not admit guilt, but she did not challenge the court's authority. She then asked the crowd to pray for the king, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign lord. This was an act of breathtaking magnanimity, or perhaps of the most profound irony. To praise the mercy of the man who had orchestrated her murder was a statement so divorced from reality that it could only be understood as its opposite. Finally, she spoke of her own fate. "And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best." It was a plea to history, a quiet request for future generations to look beyond the sham trial and see the truth. "And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me." With that, her performance was over. She removed her ermine cloak and her headdress, tucking her dark hair into a cap. The tradition for an execution by sword, a French custom, was for the condemned to kneel upright. Anne knelt, her posture erect and proud. She began to pray. "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The swordsman, according to one vivid account, needed a distraction. The victim had to be unaware of the exact moment the blow would fall to prevent them from flinching and botching the strike. He reportedly called out, "Where is my sword?" causing Anne to turn her head for a fraction of a second. In that instant, he drew the heavy two-handed weapon from its hiding place, and with one swift, silent, horizontal stroke, her life was over. It was done with such surgical precision that her head was severed in a single motion, her lips still said to be murmuring a final prayer as it fell to the straw-strewn scaffold. The silence was broken by the sound of a single cannon shot fired from the tower walls. It was a signal. Miles away, on the banks of the Thames, King Henry VIII, who had been waiting for this very sound, knew that he was a free man. His great matter was finally, truly over. Anne Boleyn was dead. The aftermath was as swift and brutal as the execution itself. There was no coffin ready for the former Queen of England. Her ladies-in-waiting, weeping, wrapped her head and body in a white cloth and, according to legend, placed them in an old arrow chest found in a nearby chapel. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, alongside the broken bodies of her brother and the other men condemned with her. The erasure began immediately. The very next day, Archbishop Cranmer issued a dispensation for Henry to marry Jane Seymour, his new love. They were formally betrothed just 11 days after Anne's execution. Across the kingdom, royal commands were issued to strike Anne's name from prayer books, to remove her coats of arms, to obliterate her falcon badge and her crowned A from every palace wall. It was a systematic attempt to memory hole a queen, to pretend the last 3 chaotic years had never happened. But a ghost is a difficult thing to erase. The ghost of Anne Boleyn would haunt Henry for the rest of his life. His marriage to Jane Seymour finally gave him a son, but Jane died from complications of childbirth, a tragedy many saw as divine judgment. His next 3 marriages were a parade of failures and further executions. He never again found the passion or the intellectual equal he had in Anne. In his final years, he was a lonely, paranoid, and morbidly obese tyrant, tormented by a festering leg wound, and perhaps by the memory of the woman he had sent to the sword. And then there was Anne's final and most glorious revenge. It was not a curse or a haunting. It was her daughter, the child who had been declared a bastard, the product of an incestuous and treasonous union. The girl who had been cast aside and forgotten survived. And in 1558, Elizabeth I ascended to the throne of England. She would go on to rule for over 40 years, becoming one of the greatest monarchs in English history, her reign now known as the Golden Age. She was fiercely intelligent, witty, and possessed of a will of iron, all qualities she inherited from her mother. She never married, famously declaring herself married to her kingdom. She solidified the Protestant Reformation that her mother had championed. Through her daughter Anne Boleyn, the disgraced queen buried in an arrow chest had the last word. Her bloodline defined an era. The ghost had finally claimed the throne. The horror of Anne Boleyn's execution was not the single stroke of a French sword. That was a mercy. The true horror was the 17 days that preceded it. It was the spectacle of a human being, a queen, being systematically and publicly dismantled by the very machine that had created her. It was the psychological torment of watching her entire world, her friends, her family, her honor, her marriage, her child's legitimacy, being fed piece by piece into the gears of state power, all to satisfy the paranoid ego of a single man. Her story is a chilling case study in the anatomy of a political murder. It demonstrates how quickly the apparatus of justice can be weaponized, how an indictment can be a work of fiction, and how a trial can be nothing more than a stage play with a predetermined final act. Thomas Cromwell was its brilliant, ruthless director, and King Henry VIII was its silent, brooding producer. Anne was merely the lead actress in her own tragedy, and her only role was to die on cue. But her story is also more than that. It is a deeply human drama about the terrifyingly thin line between love and obsession, between passion and paranoia. Henry VIII did not just discard Anne Boleyn. He needed to obliterate her, to turn her into a monster in the eyes of the world, perhaps to justify the monstrous nature of his own actions to himself. He broke with the most powerful institution on earth, the Catholic Church, to have her. And then he broke every law of decency and justice to be rid of her. She was the great love of his life, and she was the great obsession of his hate. The ghost of Anne Boleyn does not haunt the Tower of London because of a grisly death. She haunts history because her story is a timeless and brutal reminder of what happens when absolute power is concentrated in the hands of a fallible, insecure human being. It shows how the personal desires of a ruler can become state policy, and how a nation's destiny can be altered forever by a toxic mixture of lust, ego, the desperate need for a male heir. Today, we look back and see the absurdity of the charges, the cruelty of the process, but we must not forget that it was all done under the color of law, witnessed by thousands, and justified in the name of the king's safety and the stability of the realm. The most terrifying monsters are not those who break the rules, but those who rewrite them to suit their own dark purposes. The story of Anne Boleyn is not just a tale of a dead queen. It is a warning about the fragility of power, the poison of unchecked authority, and the enduring strength of a legacy that refused to be erased. Our mission here is to uncover these human tragedies that lie buried beneath the grand narratives of politics and power. We believe that by understanding the personal cost of history, we can better understand ourselves. If you believe in the importance of telling these stories, of giving voice to the silenced, then join our community. The past is never truly past, and every story we unearth is a lesson for the future. Subscribe and share your thoughts below. Which other figure, trapped and crushed by the gears of history, deserves to have their story told?